Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. So now we turn to a man who's bobbing around in the ocean. A chap called Mensun Bound, you might have heard of him. This is going to be very interesting, this next little segment, I have to say. And there's a ship out there bobbing around, and there is Mensun, who's wearing a nice, freshly pressed shirt, which is quite rare for Mensun. Hello, Mensun. He said hello, but I can't hear his voice. Testing.
Yeah, we're just. How's that, Steve? You got us?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Mensun, I have one question before I hand over to Tim. Why are you not here exactly? You're doing something special?
Yeah.
Okay.
Our lives took a bit of a swerve. We were down in the Falkland Islands, and suddenly the call came in, and before we knew it, here we are in the middle of the ocean, where we've got 5,000 meters of water under our keel, and I can't say it's an archaeological job, but I can't say any more than that because we're buried under NDAs. But once the project's over, then we're released and we can talk about it. But it is exciting, it is big, and I can't wait to. And by the way, let me just introduce my friend Chad Bonney. He was with us on Endurance, both Endurance expeditions, and old friend. He and I go way back, a lot of missions together. Anyway, back to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks, Mensun. I'm going to hand you over to somebody you might know called Timothy. Okay, is that all right? Here we go, Tim.
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Jacob. I was a member of the Endurance 22 expedition, which in March of 2022 discovered Shackleton ship Endurance in the Weddell Sea. My job was to share that spark of this expedition with the next generation of students, and I can say I think we did that pretty well. It's a real pleasure today to be talking with Mensun and Chad, who, as you know, are joining us from sea, undisclosed location, very mysterious. But we know that this room in particular are some of the world's foremost experts in Shackleton, some of certainly the most passionate of his acolytes, and we wanted to do something really special for this group today. I hope you've had a chance over the last a couple of years to read some of the amazing books that have come out, not the least of which is Mensun's, and also see the amazing documentary film that was released just a few months ago. But we have a world premiere of something very special, and before I take up too much time, I want to turn it over to Mensun and Chad to say hello. Hey, guys.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for those kind words. Just for the record, you were just amazing on the Endurance 22 project. So glad to have you with us, and what you did to get word out to all those kids all over the world was just incredible. Heartfelt thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We're gonna start with a very brief sort of introductory 2-minute overview of what the Endurance 22 expedition was for anyone here who may not be aware. And I need my clicker for that. Here we go.
Endurance has been found at a depth of 3,000 metres.
And there's even better news than that, because not only has it been found, she looks amazing.
In what's been called a milestone of polar history. And let's get more on this for you with historian Dan Snow.
I was watching archaeologist Mensun Bound and his subsea team working around the clock for a month in some of the most hideous conditions on planet Earth. It was minus 35 degrees of wind chill. They were working through the night. It was brutal working conditions.
I was stunned, absolutely stunned. The wreck is in incredible condition. There's virtually nothing living on it at all. You can still see the original paint on the vessel. It's as if it sank only yesterday.
As I speak, we have the submersible down there conducting a 3D LiDAR survey of the whole area, including the debris field. And with that, we'll be able to construct 3D models of the wreck, which are millimeter perfect, if you like.
All right, fantastic. Mensun, can you hear me? There you are. All right. We're all up to speed on Endurance 22 expedition. Can you start by telling us, please, how this expedition came to be?
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. It was 10 years in the making, this whole project. Since we found the wreck, there have been a few mythologies and, shall we say, incorrect narratives growing up around it. But I was there the very day the project was conceived. It all began it was August the 11th, I think it was, of 2012. It was myself and a very good friend and colleague. I can't give you his name, but we're meeting up in a coffee house in London to talk about wrecks. And in particular, we wanted to talk about not Shackleton's Endurance, but Scott's ship, the Terra Nova, because that year the Natural History Museum was organizing a big centennial celebration of the great man's, life and achievements. And they asked me if I could find the Terra Nova. And as it happened, I had some really good coordinates for that wreck. And I said, absolutely so, give me 6 days, the right kid, I will find the Terra Nova for you. I was that confident. So I'm meeting with my friend in a cafe near a coffee shop on the Old Brompton Road in South Kensington, London. And he was holding a table. I was over there getting the coffees. And as I was waiting for them to pour, I was leafing through that day's complimentary copy of, they say it was the Times. In fact, I think it was the Telegraph. And on page 7, there was an article there. This is absolutely true. Headline, Terra Nova found. And I was completely devastated. So I went back to my friend. He said, Mensun, what's wrong? I showed him the article. He looked at it, and I remember he sort of scratched his head like this and then tugged on his chin. And then he sort of looked up at me and he said, well, what about the Endurance? And that was the moment of inception. And it all went from there. What's important here is that he went on to develop the great company, Ocean Infinity. Our original plan was to go into the field the next year, to begin the search in December of 2013. And I was in conversation with ships and things like that. But then we realized just how complicated this project was. And anyway, what is my point? My point is this, that this project was not my idea. I've seen it written and I've heard it said many times that it was my idea. It wasn't my idea. It was my friend's idea, and everything derived from him and Ocean Infinity. You know, the idea, the technology, the technicians, the ship, and every single penny came from Ocean Infinity. Anyway, we set up a committee after a few years, and then he tasked me with finding the wreck, and a friend of mine called John Kingsford was putting together all the hardware. We formed a committee, and it all went from there. It was 10 years' work.
Amazing.
Back to you, Tim.
Thank you for that background. A lot of us in this room, and there's a picture of the Cafe Nero, the famous coffee shop, soon to become a stop on the polar sort of history circuit, I think, through London. But Mensun and Chad, and I should say Chad was introduced at the beginning, but Chad is an AUV wizard. He was the AUV supervisor of the Endurance 22 expedition from the great state of Louisiana. And we have something very special. I think I'm right in saying this is a North American premiere for sure. Maybe shown once before at Oxford, but Mensun and Chad wanted today to show you the raw ROV footage from the first time eyes were set on Endurance. So I'm going to start playing that, and Chad and Mensun, if you would please just tell us what we're looking at.
Okay, we had to get, we got the sonar image, but sonar images are a bit abstract, right? Yeah. We had to get confirmation that it was the Endurance. So here you see us going in on the site. This is with eyeballs this time, not sonar. And do you want to take over? We're converging on what we think is the record.
At this point, we had already found it in side scan sonar. The surveyors had established a coordinate for the target that we found. And then from there, we were able to take the Saab AUV, and my friend and colleague, Robbie McGonigal, was actually piloting at the time. We were slowly flying in, and this is basically a fisheye camera. And you can see the seabed, and then all of a sudden you'll come up and it pan up, and you start seeing the wood of the vessel in pretty much pristine condition. It was amazing. We had these little shelters. Basically, it was a 3 meter by 3 meter container, that insulated container that we were working out of, and there was probably 6 or 7 of us in there, and you can truly hear a pin drop when we finally started seeing the hull of the vessel, but it's you can see it right there.
It was incredible.
The wood was amazing.
And we went up and over the port side, not the main deck.
What was amazing is when we finally started lateral movements with the Saab AUV in that camera, and you start coming around. We came around the bow of the ship up the starboard side, and then around the stern of the vessel, and you can slowly start seeing the E, the N, D, U, and just the whole Endurance emblazoned on the stern of the vessel. That's when, we went from complete silence to cheers and roars within that little bitty shelter container.
And here's the irony of it all. Myself and John were out on the ice at the time. We missed the moment when the sonar image came through.
Yeah, Mensun was out on a leisure walk, and everybody else was working the deck, so we had to call him back in. There you go.
Oh God, yeah. And the thing about this film, this film is only 3 minutes long, isn't it? Because you're running out of battery. And I remember here we are going on the main deck.
That's it.
Yeah, towards the bow, and we're just losing battery the whole time. That's the foremast you can see there. That's the forecastle deck. And at this stage, you're bringing it up, aren't you? Because you've got to get that back to the ship. And there's the bow. I can see it
once we finally had visual confirmation with the camera, it was pretty much bring the AUV. We were at the very end of the battery cycle on the AUV, so we had to bring it back up.
In fact, you ran out, didn't you?
Yeah,
you had
on the way up.
A dead vehicle recovery.
Pretty much,
didn't you? Yeah. Pretty amazing. There we go. We're losing battery, and Sabretooth is going up. That was incredible.
It worked out because when we brought it took quite a while before we could turn around and go back in, and we were able to get Mensun and John back, and that's when he was told about it, and the excitement and cheers erupted from that point on.
Yeah, I remember we got back on the ship together, and I was frozen to bone, and all I could think about was just getting some warm fluids in me. And suddenly this kid appeared, and he was one of the cadets from the bridge, and he said, "Mensun, Captain Bengo asked me to convey his respects and say your presence on the bridge is required immediately." And I was there remonstrating with this lad, saying, "Come on, give me a break here. I've got to get some coffee, and then I'll come to the bridge." And then the intercom came out demanding that we get up there. We raced up to the bridge. Yeah, we're racing up. And I do remember we're on level 3, and one of the French data analysts was standing in the doorway there, and he had this smile on his face from ear to ear. And I just knew at that moment there had to be something.
He had a grin that you just couldn't mistake.
Because at that moment we were thinking they're going to tell us they'd lost the vehicle or there'd been an accident on the ship. But at that moment, I was thinking, hey, this could be good news. Then we spill out on the deck. And I remember Captain Benga was standing right on the center line of a ship, right in front of the main console.
Yeah.
And beside him was a guy called Nico Vincent, the best, most amazing underwater engineer I've ever worked with. And he strode up to us and he took his iPhone, he thrust it in my face like that. He goes, gents, let me introduce you to the Endurance. And at that point, you guys were jumping up and down and punching in the air.
It took it. So we were told to stay quiet until they can break it to Mensun. So it took everything we had to keep a straight face as he was walking back onto the deck and everything else.
I remember somebody came up on deck. They opened the door, and at the same time, everybody in the ship was kind of like informed.
Yeah.
And this roar, it was like an orchestral crescendo, just came up through the doorway onto the bridge. It was utterly amazing. And Freddie Ligthelm was one of the great heroes of that project. He doesn't get the credit he deserves. He was on duty. He was the ice master. And he was over, I remember him, he was on duty. He's wearing his gold epaulettes, and he was right over in the right bridge ring. And he came striding across to me. And I do remember this. He put out his right hand. I met it with mine. And he said, Mensun, these were his words, because somebody caught them on an iPhone. Mensun, the quest is over. How do you feel? And without missing a beat, I said, Freddie, I feel the breath of Shackleton himself on the back of my neck. That was a good one for me. I mean,
All right.
Anyway,
thank you both.
Go for it.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say we're looking at one of the composite images, or we were looking at one of the composite images of the whole wreck site. And Chad, I know you know a lot about how this came together, what it takes to produce an image like we're looking at, which was...
Oh yeah, that's the Voyage camera image. So the Voyage camera that we were using was actually the only acquisition at the time we could do was black and white imagery. So that actually started as a laser and still camera imagery, all black and white. And then a guy named Pierre Legal, who did months and months of processing during the project and after to create that image in color. So this was at least a 7 or 8 month process, if not more, to get all these images. And what it is, there's thousands of images taken throughout this whole thing. It was mounted to the bottom of the AUV, the sub AUV. So what we did is we were able to fly a grid pattern on top. We were able to turn it 90 degrees and fly along each side. And because it was slightly keeled over, we were actually getting some shadow zones with the camera. So with the amazing maneuverability of the saber-tooth AUV, we were actually able to turn this AUV almost at a 45 degree facing back up toward the shadow area of was it the starboard side that was facing down, keeled over?
Yeah, starboard side.
Yeah.
But the point is that amazing vehicle we had, the Sabertooth, it could hover at any angle.
Yes.
You could pitch it any way you like. You could turn it upside
there
down.
was 6 degrees of maneuverability with this AEV. So, and honestly, we were able to, we even tested that theory, but we were able to turn it upside down slightly, just for a few minutes and then come back over just to test its maneuverability. But it played an integral role in capturing all of the laser scans and the pictures that created the mosaic that you saw just a while ago.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chad. We're looking at one of the zoomed in photos, and Mensun, I'll turn it over to you in just a second, but we can see even like some of the saw lines on some of the deck planks, it looks like.
Yeah, I think the point of this picture was, it's hard for us to see exactly, but I think it's the poop deck. Yeah, it is. And the point of this picture is I'm trying to show you the engine room skylight, which I think is in the bottom left corner, as I recall. And the reason I'm showing you this is not because you're interested in skylights very much, you're probably not, but because what was interesting was during the research phase, my wife and I, Joe, we did a lot of work in regional archives in Norway. And in the course of that, we found in all the ship's plans and a lot of correspondence, the man who conceived the ship, all this stuff was unknown, and we've recently published it. But the point is, we found the plans for the skylight. And I think, Tim, if you go to the next picture, you can see the architect's drawings for that skylight there. And I think on the picture on the other side, there's correspondence there from the man who conceived the Endurance, or the Polaris, as she was then called, writing to the builders, talking about how he wanted the skylights to be, and I think he included a little sketch there. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, there was an intellectual dimension to our work. We weren't just out there looking for wrecks for the sake of finding wrecks. No, we went in with a purpose, and there was a very strong underlying intellectual academic role to what we were doing. Okay, this one here, I think, if I remember right, I'm trying to, it's the shot of the poop deck. And what I'd like to do, if I was with you, I'd draw your attention to a little item which is on the deck there in the top left corner. And I think, Tim, in the next slide, we can step in closer and see what I'm talking about. Yes, okay. The moment I remember Pierre came to my room and he said, Mensun, I think we've found a handgun on the wreck. And I said to him, Pierre, no, I don't think so, because I happen to know that Shackleton took all the handguns with him when he left the ship. But I went with him, of course, down to the deck to see what he had found. And yes, he's right. It was a handgun, but it wasn't a pistol. It was the ship's flare gun. And that, of course, brought back the famous story of when Shackleton left the Endurance for the last time. He went up on the poop deck with who would have been Hurley and wasn't Worsley, so it would have been Frank Wild. And he took the ship's flare gun and he put a detonator cap in it, and then he raised the gun, and in salute to the flag, he fired it, and then he threw the flare gun down on the deck, and he left the ship for the last time. He never went back on again. And, you know, there was the flare gun on the poop deck, pretty much where he must have been standing. And that ship fell through, 3,000 meters, and it's still there. Incredible.
In pristine condition.
In pristine condition.
We're going to go sort of rapid fire through some of the other artifacts that we saw on the deck, and you can maybe just tell me what we're looking at.
Okay, I think the purpose of this one was to show you a boot. It's there to one side, that picture, and we're quite excited to see this boot because we were absolutely convinced it was Frank Wild's boot, because in the photographs of that boot, which you can see there on the left now, in photographs of Frank Wild, that you can see there on the right, he's wearing a seaman's boots. And his boots had a very distinctive buckle just below the knee. And you can see that buckle on the boot, which is on the deck. All the other regulation issue sea boots were very different, but Wild had them with buckles. So, you know, the greater likelihood is that it was Frank Wild's boot just laying there. And then before we go to the next one, we're on the next one. We found this roll on the deck, and because when the images first come in, they're black and white, we didn't know what to make of this roll. I thought it was a roll of lead, because wooden ships always carry rolls of lead with them. And then it was Pierre who came to my cabin, and he said, Mensun, you know that roll of lead? Well, it's got geometric patterning on it. So I went down with him to have a look at it, and he was absolutely right. And of course, the geometric design on that roll was instantly familiar to me from that very famous picture by Hurley that you see featured on your right there, where they're all down there scrubbing the deck. And you can see the same design on the deck as we found on the roll. In other words, we found a roll of linoleum. Next one, Tim. Okay, so what am I trying to show you? Oh, right, yeah. So in this picture, what I'm trying to show you are the three holes, and you can see them there towards the bottom right-hand corner. Those were the three holes which saved their lives. You all know the story. After they left the ship, they suddenly realized they hadn't brought any supplies with them. And Hurley had the idea that they could cut through the deck and get into his old cabin, the billabong. And he knew that there was that his old cabin was stuffed full of supplies. And his reasoning was, we could just cut through the deck, we should be able to get those foodstuffs out of his old cabin. So Chipping McNish, working knee-deep in frazzle ice, he managed to cut three holes. And over a period of 2 days to 3 days, they managed to extract 3 tons of supplies through those holes there. And that food, I've no doubt at all, saved their lives. Next one, Tim. This one here, I'm trying to show you. Oh, yes, right. Okay, so it's hard for me to read what you're seeing on the screen there, but this is the ship's galley. That's the forward wall of the ship's galley. You can see the portholes there, and the mast is the foremast. But what I would draw your attention to is that little thing right in the middle of the screen, just above the spider band on the mast. That is the ship's bell. It's just laying there as innocently as you would like. I got to say that we did everything by the book. We didn't touch anything. We trod lightly. We filmed, we photographed, we recorded, and we left. We didn't disturb anything. It was a strict non-disturbance survey. So that bell is still there. Next one, Tim. Okay, so after we found the wreck, we had to go to South Georgia to pay our respects to the great man. And what we did was, when we got to South Georgia, we held a small ceremony at graveside over which I presided. And I began by inviting Captain Bengu to say a few words. He and I had talked it over in his cabin beforehand, and he agreed he'd say something, but I had no idea what he was going to say. And it was actually very moving because he started to talk directly to Shackleton as one ship's skipper to another. And he began, I remember his words, he began saying, "Boss," Shackleton's nickname, "Boss, we've come to tell you that we've found your baby." And then he said a few more words like that. Then he got down on his knees and he produced from out of his jacket a laminated photograph, the famous photograph of the Endurance, the stern of the Endurance. And I remember looking up at that point, and everybody had misted over. It was a very moving moment. And then John spoke about how when Shackleton was down there, World War I was raging, and how when we were down there, you remember that day, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and it just came down on us like a wet blanket. I've never seen a mood on a ship plummet like it did that day. Oh my God! And then who next? Oh, then I invited the great Dan Snow, Dan to read Shackleton's favorite poem, Prospers. And you know, it's not an easy poem to understand or to read, but Dan has this fabulously rich, resonating voice, and he got every word, and he got the rhythms just perfectly. And I think for the first time in my life, I began to understand that poem. And then, goosebumps, it really was. And then I said a few words about what Shackleton meant to me, and I ended with the thought that of all the expeditions which Shackleton himself had led into danger, in the end, the only life that he lost was his own. Tim, how are we doing for time?
We are great. I see a message on the back wall that says "Thanks and wrap." So can we bring the Zoom window back up? Fabulous. You know what, gentlemen, I think it's maybe fitting to say goodbye. Thank you for that great storytelling across many miles. Cheers to Ernest Shackleton. Yeah. Happy birthday. Sláinte.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody. We wish you could be with you.
Okay. If I may be so presumptuous, I will just add a small PS to this. Back in Norfolk, UK, I was in touch privately with Mensun while all this was actually happening. Just purely a private arrangement, nothing official. And he asked me, "Stephen, do you have any idea when in the day Shackleton was buried?" I was able to get back to him and tell him about 4 o'clock local time on the 5th of March, 1922. I had no idea when the ship had been found, and he then proceeded to tell me that they'd found the ship at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. All true, and it's in his book. I'll sign his book for you later. Now we have a delightful lady, Allegra, who's going to come along, and I've got this written down in my notes. Not only is she wonderful, but she's also an expert in, quote, fandom. So if you've never heard of fandom before, you'll soon find out. And I understand, aren't I right, Allegra, that you are a volunteer director of Terra Camp, parenthesis, Annual Polar Fan Conference. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and to Mensun and Joe and everybody who organized this redux of the Shackleton 150 conference. So excited to be here. I took the subway here. I live in New York, so it's nice to be here. This will be a quick presentation, and I hope an interesting one about one of Shackleton's most talented men. All right, let's see how I can get here. Here we go. Before the days of color photography and videography, artists were vital members of expeditions, polar and otherwise. No explorer worth their salt would go anywhere without a skilled artist in their party. Royal Navy men were trained in workaday sketching and drafting, but polar explorers in particular needed someone who could capture the subtle hues and shades of ice and sky and the spirit of the unique wildlife. Many know Edward Wilson as the polar artist par excellence, and he was definitely excellent, but it's a pity that fewer are familiar with the extraordinary George Marston, Shackleton's artist. It's true that artistically he was not quite as prolific as Wilson, but that can be attributed partly to the fact that half of his polar oeuvre went down with the Endurance. Also, he did not die dramatically out on the ice, nor did he leave behind a diary, two things that ensure we remember an explorer. So here I am to lay out some of the things we could all stand to learn about Mr. Marston, with a focus on his role as entertainer. So George Marston, or Putty as he was known, was a very modest but immensely talented and popular member of two of Shackleton's expeditions. He was born in 1882 in Portsmouth to a coach builder and a daughter of a shipwright, and as a child he learned shanties from sailors who came into the Royal Dockyard. And this combination of craftsmanship and song would stay with him the rest of his life. He studied art at Regent Street Polytechnic in London, which is where he met Shackleton's sisters, Kathleen and Helen, who were also artists. During and after their art school days, they were part of an artistic bohemian set in London, showing paintings at the Royal Academy and throwing hip parties. Friends from this scene called him Muffin and Teddy Muffin, as he was rather cuddly. And the Shackleton sisters encouraged him to apply for the post of artist on their brother's upcoming expedition. There didn't seem to be anything odd about the idea of a bohemian painter and craftsman with a lusty singing voice and a love of playing the fool, signing up for what was sure to be a brutal slog to the South Pole. Marston's skills in landscape art would be valuable to Shackleton, as would his skills in handicrafts, including carpentry and bootmaking. And Shackleton tells this great story about Marston being out on a walking tour in Cornwall when cabled to come to Shackleton's office to interview for the position. And he arrived rumpled and rain-soaked mere hours later, having come as fast as he could. His promptness clearly impressed Shackleton, among other qualities. Marston's proficiency as an excellent singer, actor, and all-around humorist probably clinched his invitation to join Shackleton on his South Pole quest. So don't mind Ernest, he knows nothing about art, was Kathleen Shackleton's advice to Marston on his departure. In the summer of 1907, he was sent down to New Zealand, along with 7 other Nimrod men, packed into a single third-class cabin on the White Star Line steamer Runic. This enforced proximity for weeks created strong bonds right away. And Marston became good friends with Bernard Day, the cynic and philosopher, and the naive geologist Raymond Priestley. And Priestley recorded one of Marston's songs from the Runic trip, one that the sheltered Methodist Priestley, who was barely out of his teens, must have found shocking from this dashing and artistic London rascal. And the song was Johnny Hall, full of dams and fucks and even a bastard. So Marston is one of the standout characters in the admittedly sparse literature on the Nimrod expedition, and according to members of the expedition, Marston was always full of animal spirits, had the frame and face of a prize fighter and the disposition of a fallen angel, and was not a scientific man. This last one because, while collecting rocks with Professor David, he became tired of adding to his heavy bag, and he began to take one rock out of his pack for every new one that the prof gave him, while the prof cheerfully thought that all his specimens were being stored. So he was more solicitous towards animals than scientists, often engaging in comical rescues when they didn't need rescuing, such as removing penguins from their creches. And if it was not for him, the hut at Cape Royds would have been a much grimmer place. With his flair for interior design, he elaborately painted the curtains and entryway signs of the hut's berths, and his memories for music hall tunes and sea shanties made him a natural choice for resident DJ. Not only did he play records on the gramophone, but on many a night he gave impromptu performances of music and monologues to entertain the men, wearing various improvised costumes and makeup. So according to the anonymous caption writer of one Nimrod album, Marston was very fond of dressing as a girl. He made the dress out of Murray's muslin toenuts and used hemp from old rope for hair. How creative. Miss Putty appeared a few times in the hut to entertain and flirt with the men. But the cranky Scottish surgeon, Alistair Forbes Mackay, was so displeased by her pressing attentions that he threatened violence unless she made herself scarce. And Douglas Mawson remarked sadly, "It was all very well, but he was not the real thing." So during the winter, Marston was in charge of producing the lithographed illustrations for the expedition book Aurora Australis, which was a nightmarishly difficult process in the cramped quarters of the hut. And when summer arrived, he was a hard sledger and worker. During an expedition up Mount Erebus, he rescued Priestley from a precarious position on the ice-covered slopes, warming Priestley's frozen extremities against his own stomach, much to his own discomfort. He painted and sketched in frigid temperatures and helped move tons of supplies to Hut Point on depot journeys. And as member of the support party, he did not accompany Shackleton all the way to the pole, although at one point Wilde complained about Marshall and Adams. "If we only had Joyce and Marston here instead of these two grub-scoffing useless beggars, we would have done it easily." So I bet he would have loved to hear that. So after the Nimrod expedition returned home in 1909, the explorers were celebrated for weeks in London. Priestley, Wilde, Day, and Joyce slept 4 to 2 beds in a cramped room in Kensington, and then spent luxurious weeks drinking and playing games at Priestley's parents' home in Tewkesbury. Marston was darting in and out at the time, as he was spending a good deal of time in Petersfield to court young Hazel Roberts, a girl he had met through mutual art school friends. So in early 1910, Marston accompanied Bernard Day, Reginald Skelton, and Captain Robert Falcon Scott to Norway, where they were to test the motor sledges for Scott's upcoming expedition. Marston's position on this jaunt was unclear, but he and Day were good friends from the Nimrod, and Marston probably couldn't pass up a chance to spend time sketching and drinking in such beautiful environs, and also possibly testing out some new designs for an easily raised hoop tent that he and Shackleton had conceived of. And later in 1910 and into 1911, Marston spent a lot of time sort of hanging out at Shackleton's expedition offices, which were soon taken over by Douglas Mawson to prepare for his Australasian Antarctic expedition. At a dinner given by Shackleton to celebrate Priestley and Day heading out again on Scott's expedition, the famous singer Harry Lauder performed, and Priestley recounts how Marston performed his impression of Lauder to Lauder's amusement. And when Scott's expedition members visited the Cape Royds hut of the Nimrod soon afterwards, Edward Wilson only knew Marston by reputation, but remarked in his diary that Marston must have been a great humorist. And he was. Priestley reported in his Nimrod diary one of Marston's famous yarns. Priestley said, "Marston amused us very much tonight with a tale of a tramp who lay asleep and allowed all the neighboring insects to crawl over him until the local hornet settled in his nose. Then he arose, swore vigorously, and remarked as he brushed himself, 'Now you'll all have to go.'" So, though he hadn't joined the party in London or Tewkesbury as much as the other men, Marston kept in touch with many of them after the expedition, including Alistair Forbes Mackay, who wrote to him rather pathetically from an alcohol rehabilitation center, Aeneas Mackintosh, who wrote to him about how he dearly wished to have one final wallow, good or bad, in Antarctica. We know how that ended. And Frank Wilde, who he accompanied on a 2-month yacht cruise from Liverpool up around the coast of Scotland. So in 1913, Marston published with Nimrod biologist James Murray their volume Antarctic Days, recording the lighter side of exploration. It was written mostly by Murray and illustrated by Marston, although it included a long essay from Marston detailing his continuing passion for sea shanties. And now this volume, much to my sadness, goes for thousands of dollars as one of the most sought-after Antarctic first editions. I think they've got one out there. So Marston married Hazel Roberts in the summer of 1913, and their daughter Heather was born later that year. but his next adventure was around the corner. And no, it was not a star turn on the music hall stage, as one Miss Julia Levy proposed, and she said, "I understand you have an exceedingly good voice, and if you care to entertain engagements on the music halls pending the departure of the expedition, I shall be glad to look after your interests." So, it seems like he had fans. So as a loyal Shackleton man, well-liked by the boss and part of his inner circle, Marston was one of the men first announced to be taking part in the Trans-Antarctic expedition, and he played a central role in its planning. But it's a curious fact that he did not take the same role as cheerful clown on the Endurance as he had on the Nimrod. Now, this may have been because of the role of the entertainer had been filled by Shackleton with one Leonard Hussey, the cheerful banjo-playing meteorologist hired because he had a funny face, and also by photographer Frank Hurley, whose pranks on Mawson's expedition had been legendary. Now, how Marston felt about his role as official visual documentator being usurped by Hurley is unclear. He told Thomas Ord-Lees that peace at any price was the way to remain equanimous on a polar expedition, and he didn't pick fights, even though he complained in a letter to his wife that Lees was the most awful snob he had ever come across. Now, it was perhaps harder than he thought it would be to leave his wife and child behind. Shackleton had an increasing dislike for Marston during the Trans-Antarctic expedition, perhaps because of this melancholy, which was so unlike the man he had been on Nimrod. Now, there were still some moments of levity. He dressed in drag and played records, as on Nimrod, and elaborately decorated his bunk, ever the interior designer and craftsman. Riding the motor sledge, he play-acted at being an ice cream man, handing out treats to Hussey and others pretending to be Cockney urchins. And he and Wilde shaved each other's heads, and Marston painted an absurd face onto Wilde's bald head that he then displayed through the neck of his sweater, which everybody loved. But when the Endurance went down, so did Marston's mood even further. So far from his beloved family, he was fearful and depressed. He was one of the few men who expressed outward pessimism about their situation, going so far as to remark to Hussey that he'd rather commit suicide by laudanum rather than spend a winter on the ice. And now, this must have really pissed Shackleton, the optimist, off. So while perhaps not cheerful, he did remain important to the expedition. On Elephant Island, his oil paints were used to caulk up the seams of the James Caird in order to make it seaworthy. He also planned and executed the idea of upturning the two other boats in order to create their shelter. And he was the owner and reader of the Penny Cookery book, which provided the men with so much imaginative fuel during those long months. But he also suffered being the butt of the joke sometimes, being teased for his girth by Worsley and offered food to fatten him up further for eventually being eaten. I mean, leave him alone. But he had his final triumph when he was the first person to spot the approaching Yelcho and alert the men. He said, "Ship ho!" And then he also said, "Hadn't we better light a fire?" And everyone was like, "What?" So returning, probably very gratefully from his ordeal, he penned an article for the Manchester Guardian in late 1916. Now, this is a first-hand account of something much mentioned by histories of the Endurance expedition, but not often examined in depth. How astonishing it must have been to return to a world at war. And he said, "Getting into touch once more with the outer world, our senses were stunned by the amazing facts we were called upon to accept. The world seemed mad, and we its only sane members." He went on, "The depth of the change in the life of London dawned on us gradually. Day by day, small unfamiliar incidents multiplied until we felt strangers in our own home. The armed guards on our railways and docks, the warnings to the public in railway carriages, the convalescent soldiers in the street, the searchlights which scan the sky, and the cheerful way in which dark, clear nights are spoken of as good Zepp weather, all combined to overpower the homecomer with strangeness." And that's the group of Endurance members returning on the steamer in 1916. So Marston's life after Endurance did not include military service. Perhaps he was excluded on account of his weight or health. He had another child with Hazel, but sadly they separated at some point in the 1920s. He worked as an art teacher at Bedales School and subsequently as the director of the Rural Industries Bureau, turning his love of handicrafts into an impressive career which took him all around the country to local fairs and village workshops. He attended the yearly meetings of the Antarctic Club in the 1930s and often performed sea shanties at local gatherings, as well as a famous penguin impression. And he passed away in 1940 at age 58 from a heart attack. And this is Marston at the Antarctic Club, and you can see him surrounded by other Shackleton men, including Clark and Joyce and Wordie right there. So as someone that has worked with comedians professionally at the Edinburgh Fringe and elsewhere, I am fascinated by the role a comedian plays on a polar expedition. Shackleton placed a very high emphasis on morale, and putty was a central part of his scheme to keep the spirits high on Nimrod. Many other members remarked in their diaries on his antics, costumes, and musical skills. And the fact that he does not emerge so vividly as a member of the Endurance speaks both to the higher density of standout characters on that expedition, with Shackleton perhaps having learned lessons from his last one about who to hire, as well as Marston's lowered capacity for silliness due to his family situation and increased melancholy. But as his continued involvement with the Antarctic community shows, he treasured the memories of his polar adventures and was proud of the role that he played as Shackleton's artist, craftsman, and entertainer. So, what is a polar expedition without a sense of humor? Probably something close to hell. The Belgica expedition, noted by subsequent explorers as pretty much the exact template of what not to do, was saved in a psychological sense, not only by Frederick Cook's invention of light therapy to lift polar ennui, but by Emil Rakowitz's body and pointed caricatures, which so cheerfully satirized their own dire situation and allowed them to see the humor in it. And the naval atmosphere of the Discovery expedition was likewise lightened by the South Polar Times, full of comic doggerel and cartoons, which acted as an escape valve for some of the interpersonal frustrations of close quarters on the frozen-in ship. On that expedition, like the Arctic overwinterings of old, organized comedic theatricals were performed as a company, encompassing the long tradition of polar drag. And while no comic performances took place on Scott's Terra Nova, a new edition of the South Polar Times cast expedition members in various caricature roles, with geologist Griff Taylor finding occupation as a prolific comic prose stylist and Edward Wilson illustrating his articles. And now, Roald Amundsen might be seen as a humorlessly efficient explorer, but even he hosted a drag performance aboard the Fram on their way to the Antarctic, starring, oh, it's gone. It's okay, I don't have a picture of that. Starring Hjalmar Geertsen. So hiring for a polar expedition, both personal and professional qualifications are in play. Now, Scott, focusing on scientific excellence as he did, was very lucky in hiring a few men who also just happened to be very funny. The second winter, with the diminished party after the death of the Polar Party and the departure home of many more men, including Griffith Taylor, was remarked upon by many to be suffering from a lack of humor and entertainment, which contributed to ennui and enduring trauma. Had Taylor been around to lighten the mood, might Cherry Garrard have returned a slightly less scarred man? That is a topic for another presentation. But I hope that I was able to illuminate the life and times of George Marston, a very unique explorer for you, and in doing so, show how even the lesser-known members of Shackleton's expedition had an important part to play. And for all of you Explorers Club members planning your own expeditions, wanting to walk in Shackleton's footsteps, maybe consider taking someone along just because they're creative and fun. I don't know, just a thought. And that's it, and thank you very much.
You never disappoint, Allegra. Thank you so much. Richard, would you like to come forth and explain the next move?